Welcome to our 45th episode of Apex Instant Tips, coming to you live every Friday at 12:05 Eastern Time for 5 minutes only. From Massachusetts, my name is Hayden.
And I'm Anton. And Hayden, always good to join you again. We only have 5 minutes, but we're going to be a little bit different this week. We usually really show something that like you can do in Apex, but I want to have a little bit more of a conversation today about I've been reading some of your blog posts around testing. I know testing's
I'm flattered.
A real a real passion of yours, and in particular, I caught one that talks about different tools for doing different kinds of testing, and I thought that was really pertinent to the situation I'm in right now, where I need to make sure that my applications can scale to the right number of users, and that I have enough hardware. Like I actually have the opportunity to purchase new hardware if I need it, and so I want to make sure that I make good use of what I have and figure out how to scale it. So
right. So like you were saying, we have this application, and we want to know that it can handle the anticipated volume of users that we'll have in production. So
right.
currently this is dev. We anticipate a volume of users of 100,000.
Right. Which is a big number, right?
And so it's a big number, and we want to know on day one, is it going to go? Is it going to crash?
Right. And so yeah, let's kick off the timer. Let's have a discussion about how we would go about doing this. So
right. So let's work our way towards Jmeter as the answer. Okay. I'll suggest that the ideal answer for how to give ourselves the confidence that everything will go well on day one would be to hire 100,000 testers and have them go out at a production-like environment and see how well the system holds up.
I mentioned I have a little bit of budget. I don't have that kind of budget, and if I did, I wouldn't have any left for any kind of hardware if I had it. But the other thing about that is, people are really good at testing the application and the functionality, but it's a waste of human capital to put them out to just bang on a system to create load. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. It's abusing people. Yeah.
Right. So that wasn't an honest recommendation. Right. Let's work our way down the scale of perfection. And how about we launch 100,000 instances of a browser testing software like Cypress or Selenium, and have them run through a series of scripts that approximate the path of an anticipated user in production.
Sure, and I've used those tools as well, and I think that's definitely a reasonable idea. The one thing is, or two things is, it's a fair amount of work to set up all that Selenium or Cypress testing, but also I've experienced that there's no way I could test even approach 100,000 users using my laptop. I'd need at least 100 laptops to get that.
Yes, and I think our computers would struggle to run 1,000 instances of a browser testing software, let alone 100,000.
And the other thing that those are doing is they're really geared towards testing the functionality application. As we talk about this, I'm realizing I'm not really talking about testing the functionality. I'm just talking about testing the infrastructure, the back end, making sure that ORDs and the database and all the pieces can handle it.
Right. So you're leading directly towards the what is actually my recommendation, which is to use Apache Jmeter, the free software. So this is within your budget and will help you simulate a load of 100,000 users. Is it a free lunch?
Well, I've used Jmeter as well, and I can tell you it's not. There is absolutely work to do with Jmeter, but it would definitely allow me to do the kind of scaling testing that I'm looking for.
Right.
So what would be the steps to get to that point?
Well, let's. I think it's helpful to really understand what Jmeter is testing to design effective tests that will give us actionable answers. So I think it is critical to understand that Jmeter is translating your Apex application into a series of GET and POST requests. So
it's really not a browser. It's not looking at JavaScript. It's not looking at really your application really so much as just that network traffic back and forth and creating that.
Right. I'll make the analogy. If UTP-SQL had a scaling property that allowed you to test your PL SQL, Jmeter is doing little more than just scaling UTP-SQL.
Yeah, well, I'll add in, it does get the Apex engine in the ORDS connection pool as we have here, but you're right. It's really about loading up that database and looking at a little bit at the middle tier, that kind of thing.
Right.
So
what? So now that we understand that, what should we test in Jmeter?
Well, and I know we've had this conversation before, that you would have a huge lift to try and test all of your application, to try and run through every pathway and everything, and that it's just not realistic. But what you're really looking is to pick a few pathways that make sense, and to run your tests with different scenarios of data volumes, user counts. But the other thing
I'll quickly interject to support the point you just made, which is it would be quite an effort to test your entire application, because for every corner of your application, you're having to translate into a series of GET and POST requests. I have a YouTube video that we'll link to on how to do this properly, but just to illustrate the level of difficulty involved, to say authenticate yourself in the Apex application, you perform a GET request against a login page, you scrape the HTTP response for a series of parameters that you then pass to the authentication engine, which requires more than just your username and password. It also requires
a whole
your page
8 things
ID.
that looks like a whole bunch of stuff.
So it's not overwhelming, but it's not trivial either. So you want to be you're encouraged to make decisions about what you're looking to test.
Right. So I think, we've exhausted our 5 minutes, but I'd like to ask, what's your takeaway from this conversation?
Yeah. So to me, recognizing that Jmeter is only testing the back end gives us the permission to think more flexibly about how we actually test an application with Jmeter. So if, for example, the authentication scheme is complicated, or the path to get to the point of vulnerability is really tedious to test, maybe give Jmeter a break and cut down a few barriers to entry for your tests, so that you can apply Jmeter where it actually counts. How about you, Anton? What is your key takeaway?
I think I've got actually two. I'm going to cheat a little bit and say, one is really that it's not enough to run Jmeter one time and think you've got an answer. You've got to play with the not only the Jmeter settings, how many users, ramp up to the point of where you start seeing things break, because that'll tell you, is it ORDS, is it the back end, that kind of thing. So, right. But also to run it with, load up your database with more and more volume in the tables and those kinds of things to get better expectations of that. So that's one takeaway, is that you have to run it multiple times to really get a sense of what the results are. But the other takeaway is you have to set the expectations of what you might learn from Jmeter. And your expectation should not be that you can run Jmeter and feel that your application will have no performance problems.
Right.
It's too big an expectation to ask for that for a reasonable amount of test development. You could spend more time developing your tests than you do your application, or you would certainly spend more time developing your tests than your application if you wanted to get to that point.
Right.
But if your expectation is to understand that you have sufficient infrastructure, that's something you can realistically get out of Jmeter, and you still may run into performance problems, but you've got a really good understanding that those performance problems aren't your infrastructure. It's not ORDS, it's slow. We've heard that from Chris Rice. ORDS isn't slow. Your code is slow, right? But you want to know that, right? You want to know that you're going into your environment, that your infrastructure is sufficient. And if there is a slowness, you can figure that out, right? You can rewrite your code. You can put another index on something, that kind of thing. So I think those are my two takeaways.
Completely. And certainly if you, as you mentioned, Anton, running your Jmeter test as part of your deployment cycle, it means that you have a point of comparison every time you run this test, and it allows you to zero in on why the health metrics are improving or degrading. So from one release to the next, why have the performance metrics degraded? And it has to be something in what you just deployed.
And so, Hayden, we've definitely hit our 5 minutes. I'm absolutely happy to stick around and talk a little bit more about this and answer any questions if people have them. But if people just came in for 5 minutes, we've already wasted more than that of their time. So I would say, go ahead, don't feel bad about checking out. But if you have questions, we'll stick around and we'll say hi to folks. And I have a couple more comments on it. I want to talk a little bit about your blog and your video, what they give us. So
yeah, hopefully the audience has a few questions.
Yeah. And hi to folks. I see we've got at least 2 viewers. That's good. So, and I'm gonna rewind a second. Let's first. I understand that we have a wisdom of the week or an off-topic tip or something because I did nothing.
Indeed, we do. We have a wisdom of the week that I saw on Twitter. I thought it was funny, and it struck me as very true. So ask a programmer to review 10 lines of code, he'll find 10 issues. Ask him to review 500 lines of code, and he'll say it looks good. So the wisdom here is very profound. Certainly an action from this is when you do a code review, if you are sincere about getting something out of that code review, make sure you're reviewing 10 lines of code, not 500.
Yeah, and I think today's conversation is about testing and quality and that kind of thing. I think that's really interesting. I think that's true as well about how we talked about focusing on the pathways that make the most sense. And it's the same kind of thing. We're never gonna we aren't likely to have enough tests to test all of our application pathways with Jmeter, but if we can focus on some and do a good job on those, we'll get some value out of it. So I think it's appropriate for the conversation we're having. I do want to chat a little bit. So you've got both a video and a blog post, or even maybe a couple of blog posts on this topic. I saw one link in the chat or somewhere. Where can people find these?
We'll make sure they're in the show notes. But essentially, I have a detailed YouTube video on the step-by-step of authenticating yourself with the Apex engine using how to script logging into Apex using Jmeter. Mm-hmm. And that's a very mechanical YouTube video. For a more theoretical understanding of what Jmeter has to offer, I have a blog called "What Testing Software is Right for You," in which we compare Jmeter to a variety of softwares and what special sauce it adds to the mix.
Great.
And so we'll link to both of those.
Okay, good. And the other thing I just wanted to chat a little bit about is we talked briefly on what it is you're testing with JMeter. We're going to get some, well, if anybody watches this, they may say you can do these things with JMeter, and you can. You can do some testing. You can check to see that the results that you get from JMeter are what you're expecting, that kind of thing. I don't think that JMeter is the best tool for that. I think Selenium is a better tool for a lot of that testing of the application. But what JMeter I do get out of it, and I think is an interesting thing, is an understanding of how my connection pool and my database are interacting and working together. Right. I sometimes see that my database isn't really struggling, and yet JMeter starts to slow down. What that means to me is my connection pool probably needs to be larger. And one of the things I'll just mention there is the default connection pool when you install ORDs is not big enough for most production applications.
Right.
And so, but it doesn't mean just randomly pick a bigger number. JMeter can give you a good understanding of that, right? You load things up, you see at what point the connection pool becomes the bottleneck because the database is doing just fine, but you're slowing down because you got all your connections used. You might boost your connection pool up, those kinds of things. But I don't recommend that you randomly just allow a huge connection pool either, because it is a throttle to allow your database to keep up. So,
of course.
Yeah. Anything else around the what to look at when you're running a JMeter test?
I thought you touched on a really good point earlier when you mentioned data. So I think it's very rare that your dev environment has data that actually reflects prod. I think that's a tough thing to achieve. And so I rarely see it in practice. And so if your health metrics are passing with flying colors in dev and the application is struggling in prod, it might be because the data is very different.
Yeah,
and so
and you
that's
can,
something to pay attention.
yeah, and I do think you can get by running Jmeter tests against different sets of data, different amounts of data, you get a feel for what the what boosting those data levels will do to your application. I read a great blog post a while back about somebody responsible for testing the Bing search engine. And he made the point that, yeah, we don't have a test environment that matches our production environment. There's just no way we're going to have a Bing, Bing test environment. It's just not going to happen. But you can get reasonable testing guidance out of smaller tests and smaller environments that don't match 100%. But one of the beauties of the cloud is that you can spin up, in an economical way. You could spin up in a test environment that very closely matches your production environment. You don't need to run it all the time.
That's true, and in fact, it is a service that InSum is specialized at delivering.
Oh, excellent. Don't normally, but yeah, that's great. Yeah, spinning up a cloud-based test environment and then spinning it down is definitely better than trying to purchase a whole test environment. Well, I don't see any specific questions on this topic. Maybe we'll go back to the real, here's a pinpointed tip, but here we have one here. So let's see. This is definitely a good comment. I think a lot of us as Apex developers don't think about all the pieces in between, right? And so,
right. And this is where my point about it's just UTP-LSQL scaled up is wrong, because if the slowness is related to something related to like that, your Nginx or something like that, UTP-LSQL is not going to capture that.
That's true, and of course, I think most of us realize that middle tier is pretty thin. It's not doing a lot, but that doesn't mean it can't be the bottleneck. It definitely can. So I think it's definitely worth, when you're getting ready to scale up a Jmeter test, to get the folks involved for that piece of the infrastructure, involved in monitoring it and seeing how things are going. Well,
though I will have this cautionary piece of advice. I think walking into testing without any idea of what your vulnerabilities are is mostly an unpromising way to start. Like, I think that people who are successful at testing know in advance what to test, and they have a pretty good sense of where to look. So I think it's unlikely that you're going to discover some vulnerability about your application that you're completely blindsided by.
That's a good point, and I think at some point we should talk really about integrating testing early in your development planning, right? Right, and not even in your development, but in the planning of your development, talking about testing and how you're going to do those things. And I know this is an area that is really important to you. So that said, I think it's been a full 18 minutes, which is like
we've done it again
on the far end of what anybody's willing to listen to. So thanks, everybody. Do all the things, like, send letters, call your mom, tell her about the show, subscribe,
hit that bell.
Right, all those things. Bye-bye.
See you next week.